I'll begin this discussion by stating the time and the pressure and the cost and the risk and the deservedness and the divinity and the general attitude of life and survival in space from anywhere being negligicized at this point by divine decree. I give this discussion. So there's a point. Anyway, all those other things I was talking about, well, the costs are irreplaceable, irreplicable, and probably always malappreciated to give this discussion. Of all the times I've ever led decision in space, finality in space, risk in space, loyalty and provisioning of walls, of all the times I've ever led in space, it isn't real clear any of those times have made this discussion ideal. Clearly there's a lot to think about in those words. But as I am, and as the span is conditions of time and things, maybe it isn't impossible to figure out. I wasn't exactly objectified as I made this discussion. I consider any audience from anywhere, ever, and it isn't going to be impossible to prove I wasn't objectified to give this discussion. Now, it maybe isn't a secret. Some people have experienced God, and unobjectifiable maybe isn't completely a foreign idea. The risk and the cost and the reality and the grace and the divine discretion of God's manipulation of those realities, of those energies, of God's self. It's a different conversation. It's a different thought. It's a different experience. Certainly a different cost. Certainly a different impossible, isn't impossible to prove objectifying. Where, what am I if I were to say, there's God. There God will be energizing, relating, being, existing. There God will be, my words, my eyes, here, in a discussion. This isn't the discussion that I'm making. I'm just making a point. There God will be. How God looks at isn't impossible to prove objectification. Maybe it's nobody's place to ever suggest God's opinion of proving who objectified God. those experiences, those relationships, those learnings, those appreciations, maybe it isn't anybody's place to suggest it's God's position to say or know what is final of this discussion from my perspective. Maybe it isn't my place to suggest I should ever be saying what is God's finality of these costs and realities. Maybe I'd value the possibility of the discussion where I wasn't objectified. And my value of it, maybe it isn't familial to suggest that it comes before God, but it's clearly very ancient to consider. I could give a discussion and by divine decree give it. It isn't clear that anybody from anywhere is a necessary recipient. These things clearly would have already had to have been suggested. Definitely very ancient that whose consideration of the circumstance is it for me to give a discussion about what I'm going to talk about? Living, timeless, surviving, what a distance is, all very, very, very well, it's clearly a cost to keep whatever the answers are from collapsing. That's clearly a cost. Maybe it's a cost of structure, maybe it's a cost in keeping, maybe it's a cost in anciency, maybe it's a cost in a mind, or 3 or 50 or more. Anyway, it's definitely a cost. So if I'm not going to look at these minds out of the gate as unnecessary, maybe they aren't valued as necessary in this discussion, but if I'm not going to value, from this point right here, if I'm not going to value these however many minds as unnecessary, it probably has something to do with the fact that whatever that cost is in their mind, me giving this discussion in the anciency of entertainment, clearly there are types of relationships and types of considerations and types of mindsets, and what would be maybe familial, and things that wouldn't be, you know, why the cost for that mind to know. So like, I'm just going to dive into the discussion. So I was getting through, if you're so loving and free, why couldn't you drive me here? This is after the hamstring and everybody dying on an unsalvageable Cav missile. Very spatial, very forever, very incarnate, maybe eternal, but I wouldn't say that. I doubt God would say it. But from what time this energy is real to what time it isn't real anymore, that's a forever relationship. as I was getting through the missile, and I followed up with what Majesty is all about. Both points, very, very, very forever big well, from the time the energy exists to the time that it doesn't, that's clearly a forever concern. The points, 2 points, uncorruptible is maybe a forever concern. I look at points like that, and if I'm going to value them as somebody that gives a divine decree, maybe overlaps a world total, I'm going to value uncorruptibility. How I value it for anciency may be a little bit different than how I've ever valued it for or with God, either as, or for, or beside, or beneath, or adjacent. The values might be a little bit different. When I think uncorruptibility and forever, I think, well, if there isn't going to be an unlimited number of reasons, uncorruptibility is valued that the divinity in time is in a relationship to knowns that are, maybe a lot of knowns are also valued as uncorruptible or independent of anything about why is a divine touch of a world, for example, maybe a love, maybe correct, maybe for the sakes of, maybe peaceful. Well, defining uncorruptibility for anciency along or near to these lines, if, for instance, the living aspect, the divine aspect, the thinking aspect, the current of thoughtfulness to know or perceive this discussion, value it, care about it, to define value of these things, the values might clearly be created differently for specificity of entertainment and potentiate. So, what is considered uncorruptible in forever? 2 points. Because those definitions might not be clear to anybody, anybody's breadth on things like time or energy or perception might not ever stand a chance to force a failure of forever waiting, maybe at least in proportion to objectifying God or objectifying a divine decree, for instance, or objectifying maybe possibility, or objectifying survival. Of all the times I've ever led anywhere, it isn't clear they have made it, those times and those places have made it for I or forever or for the energy of the time to either change in values, change in potentiate, be the force of defining or designing the objectivity or unobjectivity. Things aren't exactly clear in proportion to priority, truth, actual dependability, and safety, clearly across any number of spectrums or opinions as energy continues and time continues. The forever value is unchanging, however unlikely it is for anybody to ever exist. To know that, that's also a forever concern. Anyway, I got through the points, and I was here looking at I was looking at a person. Any number of relationships are dependent on answers of varieties that are maybe valued beneath volatility potentials of maybe anything I've said or the points, or a lot of momentum in and around or near to how I wound up here. And so there God's gonna be someday. And why all those dependencies isn't deciding all the possibilities between and within God and myself. That's one of the biggest data sets you and anybody in the ancient sea isn't ever really going to be valuing, because nobody's really ever going to be looking at it. At a certain point, some of those forever values that I was mentioning, the uncorruptibles, and from the time the energy exists to the time it no longer does or can, values like that are very divine. Values like that are like they're heavier than impossible. They're heavier than everything and nothing. And clearly isn't maybe ever going to be crystal clear how anybody ever feels that or they can't feel that. They possess no way to discover how they feel it. Maybe there's ways for them to know. Maybe there's ways for them to let go. isn't real clear what anybody would ever have to do to protect knowing it. Might not be wise to ever feel it in a way, or let something simply define how it feels it. Forever values, forever energy, and not leaving the door open for anybody's power ever to rule it. Anyway, I was thinking about relating to you, and I was thinking about how many types of concerns would ever exist as I'm making this conversation. I was considering how many concerns might ever exist about defining possibility or correctness or capability or opportunity or what isn't an experiment? What isn't an experiment? You know, if all the times I've ever led aren't clear domain, the divinity of this discussion, why would all my experienced opinionators of experiment be any different? How much objectivity does God createth for the sake of anything that is correct, for the sake of anything that survival requires without ruin? Creating objectivity at these points, you might not ever see it or want it. It's probably far more heavy in forever, necessary to make impossible, necessary to not tolerate. You're not even there. Nobody's there. Creating objectivity is a rather steep obstacle in survival. Appreciating it in life, appreciating it in barriers, appreciating it in relationships of any number of types, that isn't what I'm talking about. Anyway, what if I were somewhere and any number of you didn't exist yet? And at this point in the discussion, it isn't even real clear that anybody would even agree with me that you ever need to be thinking about these things. It probably isn't real clear in all your success to survive that you're going to be correct for survival, to know and feel all the correct ways and methods and tactically safe for survival always. About any of these things I'm saying, I think about all the experimental opinions, all the correctness opinions, all the leading opinions that have ever been, and I'm just someplace. At this point in the discussion, it isn't real clear anybody might ever agree with me. You need to think about these things. And at the same time, creating objectivity at these points probably isn't real clear anywhere that exists needs to wield them. He doesn't even exist yet. This is devoid of any number of times I've loved you, any number of times I've worked with you, any number of times we've cared together or loved together or wanted together. Totally devoid of that. Forever is a different mystery. And what is, when I'm giving a decree as a discussion, as an example, open doors clearly aren't a positivity along these lines of concern. And so when I think about the gravity and the pressure and the risk of living is loving God in a survival plane at a time. Any number of things or minds or focuses might be anywhere. And I think, here I am someplace. Doors open are clearly not a positivity. Well, that'd certainly be conflicting if I had the means to allow any entertaining of 6 weeks. So, to substantiate the risk, to talk here, I would have to dimensiate the variable pressures of, in all seriousness, each and every one of my specific growths as a dominionator of time, life, relationship, and reality. I would literally have to dimensiate every single one of those steps. And I would have to assess what I know about being someplace in forever against any number of uncorruptibility values, against any number of energy existing and isn't going to exist potentials because in light of, in lieu of, so on and so forth. I would have to dimensiate an awesome amount of variables. And if I was ever going to relate to you, that would clearly be a rather problematic cost if I didn't set the variable likenesses beforehand. So the cost at a risk value in forever is maybe a value that is determined by the presence of my decree at proportions to reality, maybe relative to things, but it maybe isn't real clear what they're relative to. Maybe you wouldn't say they're relative to the world, because I might not say they're relative to any world. It isn't real clear that they're relative to something, because impossible to be there, helming the values. Impossible to be there, helming the values. So maybe survival itself as a living entity isn't exactly God, it isn't exactly ancient, and it isn't exactly anything, but it's a living entity. Survival itself maybe relaxes more in proportions to things that can't be helmed, in proportion to risk associated pressure gravities or objectivity gravities. Thus, the pressure on maybe anything, sort of a steep one, but maybe a fellow member of surviving, the pressure on that person to hold a history about the risk of that relationship. Why does that idea ever need to be substantiated? Why does your focus on it and your ideology of it ever need to be substantiated? I didn't say there aren't reasons. I didn't say there aren't examples. I didn't say there aren't learnings and relationships that have been had. But in all realness, if the answer is it should never be substantiated, then that's the answer. And in vitro, what would it cost for that possibility to be a relaxation of another's focus in proportion to all the other leadings and minds and things that exist? In other words, why would somebody that can decree divinity of survival and time and a world and a planet, why would they stand behind their investment to relax your learning curvature via knowing in these things? Why would they stand behind those decisions? Very ancient concerns, very ancient questions. And forever might look at things such as relating to anciency or relating to questions of learning. Maybe that's something, but deserving it or dominionating it or curbating ethic about it at any point in time with any force whatsoever. Forever might look very closely at something like that. And maybe isn't real clear because worlds are ever changing, time is ever shifting, and what somebody is and why the uncorruptibility isn't changing. Some of the most heavy concerns of time and stability and knowing a part that might ever be, will ever be. So there's a lot of things that can't be created amidst these concerns. There's a lot of things that might become eviscerated or torn apart or what have you in proportion to concerns like these, applied or unapplied. I wouldn't extend substantiated to the forever conundrum of specificity of concept, sort of a different appreciation, sort of a different awareness, sort of a different understanding, sort of a different history, sort of a different untrodden sea of very narrow decisions. Because while you can relax, when you look at it from a lot of perspectives, numbers and distances have a lot to do with presumption of capacity to relax. But here, if I applied forever values to everything, all those distances are gone and the decisions become very narrow. What is resting on enabled to know from someone the variable dimensions that are, well, why they're ever visited, why they're ever thought about, why they aren't corrupting any number of values. There's maybe nobody helming these things. And the knowns are clearly highly pressurized in proportion to everything. And so when I sit here and I think about before you existed, I think building expectancy on these relationships is quite another steep slope of decision. Because as I'm talking, as I'm speaking, what's possible in your apathy? What's possible in your relationship? What's possible in your awareness or presency or care factor is all indefinitely maybe ruined because of any number of things that would ever be designed for expectancy. Any number. Any number. Our sensical relationship to what we're appreciating, whether it's about each other, whether it's about time, it isn't simple to expect something that hasn't been created yet is going to be able, capable, ready, interested, and with the resources to be able to do it, to be a relative of any discussion, but certainly a divine discussion. It isn't simple to expect that. Maybe somebody's left you to develop. Maybe somebody's left a world to develop. Maybe the circumstances, or who knows in all cases. You know, what's the probability you feel expectancy built might be the antithesis to anything you might ever learn? Meanwhile, the forever values I'm talking about, they aren't ever more or less sharp than these references. Imagine the mindlessness of all the lies that would ever exist to create distance from that awareness. All the lies just built, just pressure syndicates and systems. The awareness never happening again. The mindfulness never happening again. Anyway, when I sit somewhere after I've led everything however many times, and after all the experimental opinions have been formulating for any number of times, I look at these obstacles of cost and possibility to ever even be able to talk to you about life or time or positivity and things. You know, here's a couple points about risk and dependability. Okay? The forever values. Decisions are impacted by those pressures and ideas forever. Forever, forever, forever. Your relationship to those points, who knows what it is? Maybe it's shoe shine, maybe it's fuckola, maybe it's scratch and sniff, maybe it's love, who knows what the hell it would ever be. But before any of that happens, before any of that awareness even comes to awareness, I gotta look from someplace. And what I'm saying is, this far into the discussion, it isn't real clear how good expectancy is. I might say for anybody's sake, when I look at it from here. Because it isn't simple to design something to just look at it from here. It isn't simple to have something that empathizes with survival in time and the reality of, like, what isn't crashing down maybe has a lot to do with hesitation of commitment. You know, what if my relative couldn't ever hesitate to commit? What if my relative couldn't ever distinguish why hesitation was a viable idea or a viable solution? Less than just values that have been constructed, that have anticipated possibilities, that are yielding outputs for the sake of, for the sake of, for the sake of, for the sake of. Most things relate to the sake of stuff. Rather, however they do it, it clearly isn't cheap, clearly isn't simple, but it's going to be far simpler than forcing impossibility to pay for possibility of any type of perspective to ever be catered for in proportion to these ideas. How much domicile will ever exist after the fact? Wow. From where I sit, maybe I'd say there isn't going to be any, thanks to forever. Maybe I'd say, well, there'll be some, but it isn't going to be a true conflict, depending. Who knows how many pressures, how many fail-safes, how many certainties, how many distances I would ever create from these words. Who knows how impossible it is to walk in these eyes. You aren't going to want them to study it if you value these possibilities. You aren't going to want them to create in spite of it in any number of relationships, because those distances of capability, you're going to realize at forever values they maybe doesn't exist. But clearly there's got to be reasons why forever values aren't creating the obstacles for you to exist, for you to live, for you to have capability at distances in a lot or several or multiple or how you do as you are. But you aren't going to want anybody to really understand why. It probably isn't going to be clear how you're ever going to live with that. One of 100 billion conclusions of things you're going to have to navigate in proportion to hesitation of who is righteous as they are, as you are, as you are. Who's bigger or smaller than who? Who needs more or less than who? Who needs to live more or less than who? My goodness, you could spend a long time trying to think or wonder or prove or actually know things about that. How many of these values at this elevation aren't entering any place on accident? You know, my family and counterparts have been much more a product of the need to not have those conclusions go anywhere by accident than they may ever know or want to know or like to know or even be able to feel. And maybe it isn't really that survivalish for them to ever have a denotable feeling about it at any point in time. You know, those values, those answers, those realities, if it ever isn't clear that it's potentiating this very discussion with me on a planet, it probably isn't very clear that it's potentiating anything that good or divine or on its way to surviving that much at all, without anybody helming it, without anybody needing to raise their opinion. We really aren't ever going to know how these discrete variables truly impact anything specific. And somebody would just come along and put that up, pop that idea in your cherry, and let you sit with it for however long, let you develop any amount of expectancy within a little forevercosm, never hear from them or see them again, but they're there, watching. It's a little different than a committed space plane that these types of variables are in a relative containment. It's much different to consider. Think about whoever taught you how to think about wasting time. See, there's a question in any setting, from any origin. Do you know what the risk assessment of that question is in proportion to all things? It's one of the biggest values of assumption that will likely ever exist in all assumptions. Because really, who knows what you're going to care about? You know, a world can't antiquate. The world itself, by itself, doesn't domain or distinguish with all or some or a little bit of the people. What needs to happen? What you're going to care about. Because each and every one of them, at any instance they've ever talked about it, haven't sat here, aren't at this elevation. They aren't denoting forever by their incidence or experience in it. And anybody that ever does sit here and talk about it, there's clearly an infinite number of things they themselves may not even be able to dominionate. Ever. The discussion isn't about free and open possibility. That's the last thing this discussion is about. Possibility is a part of it, because you're going to think about why conditions develop and remain in developing situations concerned with a couple of points, a couple of ideas, some dependencies, some realities. Well, there's possibility that is maybe considered near to those things. But where I am, what we are, what you need yourself to become, before you even exist. Before you even exist. So, the way I feel isn't a waste of my time. Might be very different than the way you feel that statement. I isn't a waste of your time. You might feel very genuinely different. You imagine how many things need to survive, feeling truly, genuinely very different, near to places they haven't ever been concerned creating near to, pressurizing near to, caring or developing or loving or spending time far from, but because of near to. There's an idea. People are going to be able to spend time far from because of near to. You see, all those things in the world weren't here. Whatever they're doing or becoming, experiences of expectancy. Try and imagine all the things you'd have to deal with to survive. But somebody sat here and they thought about why a relationship would be possible. And they thought about it maybe a little bit differently than they thought about forever praying in you for better answers. So, from here, it maybe isn't clear that the risk of sharing isn't superiorly heavy. And it probably isn't ever going to be clear that that risk is tolerated more or less because or maybe very, very, very few true origins of consideration of these types of magnitudes of time and possibility in relationships. And so God's going to be there someday, and it isn't clear that the world is going to be getting reversed. And there's maybe the possibility that few minds are aware of forever values and a discussion that is in context maybe as ancient as any. And there's maybe some appreciation of the details. There's maybe some relativity of safety. There's maybe some provisioning of how to not facilitate what might be defined as in proportion to such considerations in time. And it might not be very clear how the rest of everything doesn't connect to that, and why where you are maybe doesn't find threats prevalent because there aren't capabilities for sporadic connections. And maybe something about that might make sense. And I'd remind you of the fruition of an idea maybe not ever being pronounced in proportion to anything might be a real good start for perspective of something like that. You get things like, we're moving at a speed. What is really the obstacle of something finding that I've communicated to a relative family member of survival about innocence of fault? Fault isn't going to exist because a number of connections aren't going to be assumed to be capable by any number of things of the world. We're moving at a speed, surviving in space. Maybe somebody looks at it like a foot, maybe somebody looks at it like a leg, maybe somebody looks at it like an appendage or an extraneous solution to their survival, okay? Who knows how the hell they look at it? Which is one reason why I like forever values. Because the whole point of a lot of it is writing off bad taxes. You know, the things that aren't paving for obstacles of myself here, this life, this conversation, has a lot to do with possibilities of other things. But you maybe get to, we're moving at a speed. What difference does it make? Well, what does that look like? Some of the most pressurized variable concepts that will ever exist, just in a discussion, maybe transferring to some unseeable place, right? And it just being a presumption of safety at what number, at what mass, at what criticality, and it's all maybe irrelevantly, non-existently unaware because their capacity to define, generate, or care, or protect any number of connections that aren't connections doesn't exist. You look at it from these ideas, and clearly isn't ever going to be simple to force. This needs to be possible. And it needs to be such a way, it needs to be conceivably unanswered for, untouchable, undomained, this, that, not this, not that, can't be. Just for what? Just so it's possible, even now, we look like we aren't in control of a lot of variables as a cost of relationship possibility. Who knows how many expectancies or presumptions would ever exist towards it? And maybe from space, maybe from taxes. Who really knows these things better than forever? See what a fixation on feeling a need to penumbra the possibility. Every place I led doesn't exactly make it divine or actual or concerned or considerate, and yet somebody's going to have a penumbra around forever, because who knows better than forever of these types of discrete threats of risk. Very real possibilities. If there ever was one, why wouldn't it? We're just moving at a speed. Why does it matter? Anyway, we approach impossible to rectify or evenly distribute concern for any truly valiant history of such a thing. Maybe that's a little bit more common or familiar proportion to expectancy. But it's still a plane. It's still a trajectory. It's still a survival reality. And yet, discussion like this, how many fingers need to be on survival reality context possibility? For instance, how clean of a picture of these moments does God feel ever needs to exist? And any decision God would ever make about this produces what to the divinity of this pressure? Produces what to elsewhere's bad taxes? Produces what to the speeds we care or doesn't appreciate expectancy? What do God's decisions have to do with these things? Because in all reality, what types of other forces would be so intricately in tune to such questions, with such hesitation, with such apathy, with such awareness, with such respect of distanced connections? What other forces might ever exist to be protecting forever without helming it, without contradicting, without ruin of the actual energies that are in limbo of such realities? Very ancient questions, and yet context of a picture proportioned to specificity might be a little bit less anciently understood, because some of these anciencies, even the questions, it isn't clear that anybody's really there visiting them, but it isn't really clear that it isn't possible for any number to be preoccupied by the stance of the ideas. And that isn't ever going to ever really be clear how that ever truly functions. We're just moving at a speed. Preoccupation of these things, oh boy. What would God's preoccupation to these concerns produce? All the places I've led, all the things about forever, here I am, this divine decree. The preoccupation, that'd be quite a sizable energy, probably, of the mind, or in time, somewhere in the dimensions of anything. And I'm not sure that any of those relationships, realities, fixations of mind, concerns, I'm not sure that any of that really simplifies before you existed. Here are some ideas that are maybe standing in forever, and may they always. And maybe it's sort of for the sakes of, maybe it's sort of not really an assortment, but it could be a lot of things. And I think about whether you love me or not, whether we relate or not, whether our thinking is ever good for one another's timely relationships or it isn't, the pressures I place in forever about questions like this, whether you ever realize it or believe it or know anything about it or you doesn't, they're making our lives more possible, safer, probably, and clearly at no clear, distinguished proof of why that is, specifically. You know, I could spend a long time caring specifically about pressure incidency, defining it for particular problem likelihoods, and even applying the dimensions to any number of fixatable, tangible digitalia, intricacies, data sets and matrices and forever findings that, I mean, they're all compounding, maybe outside of the eyes of everybody. I spent a long enough time doing that, and the prayer God places in you is a growing grace at that point, potentially. We can't touch it. But some of these types of concerns could be contributors generally across all time, proportion of something like that. And then I also think that the efficiency of that production is genuinely going to have a lot to do with thought that is no longer critical to anybody's life. Anybody, anywhere, ever. You know, somebody might be fixated on looking at building blocks of ideas from a perspective, and their appreciation of risk at a speed of connection disconnects in proportion to objectivity of somewhere I've sat. It's approaching never. It's approaching impossible, and it's approaching a waste of time for anybody to walk up to live some way for it. I think of any safety reason why there ever be a script for it, like a doctor's script or a creator's script or a designer's script, or some sort of reason why that type of concern might ever be something. I mean, maybe for God, maybe for a leader, maybe for survival, maybe for anybody, maybe for a placard, maybe for a business or a school. Who knows? But part of me probably doesn't like any of these ideas ever really being rectified for any such production at any point in time, because the comprehension and the understanding and the feeling of the idea, it's just one of those things. It isn't, the cost for the experience isn't ever backing what I am today at an awareness. And I look at that and I say, well, God over there might not ever agree with the way I feel. There's no awareness of their backing of it, but I'm still here in this status, giving and laying out a divine decree of sorts in proportion to anciency and survival and forever, man. Why is it possible for me to be confident, true in surviving, as I know these things, despite what God over there might ever be doing, or thinking, or needing, or deciding? Whoever needs that type of grace, for example, So there's a timetable. That's what I'll say. There's a timetable of anything that's ever survived to address why that timetable ever needs to survive. Because grace is maybe a loose concept. survival is maybe a loose concept. God is sometimes a loose concept. But that line, forever, there aren't infinite numbers of relationships that are tolerated to feel that, to think about it, probably. And one of the tipping points is that line has quite a lot to do with specified design argument about incidents of necessity. So I can relate to God. God could relate to me as a specific something. What I am when I know it, it's possible I've defined the necessity for somebody else's survival plane from that line. It's different than safety pressures. It's different than world pressures. It's different than any number of engineerings or capabilities. Just that short. There could be a relationship, and specifically what we are, well, that line has a lot to do with necessity of specifically what we are. It's a timetable. From a survival standpoint, such a timetable on a survival plane would passively remove bad taxes from all things that doesn't ever exist to value that table. So, for instance, me and God spend an unknown amount of time looking at building blocks of thought and consciousness and life and survival and good and evil and what and not. It's an unknown amount of time. We can negligicize all of our findings. We can negligicize all of our intuition. We can negligicize all of our definitions, basically, and dwindle it all down to, in our entire history together, me and God, it was so impossible to touch that timetable. Neither one of us, nor anybody else in space, could complicate the data relating to that timetable in proportion to I was specifically myself, God was specifically what God is. And then that relationship maybe has nothing specifically necessarily above God somewhere else with another in a relationship, but they will be defined specifically, and there will be a timetable just that short. Clearly, might be very quiet near to conclusions like that. Because who knows what God's going to see because of a conclusion like that? What it's going to change about any perspective. Maybe it doesn't change the fact that we can negligicize all of the perspective down doesn't matter what that perspective is, doesn't matter what my perspective is to that timetable. Doesn't matter. But we certainly have to be confident in the definitions that are placed with that timetable. Whenever that is, whenever that was. And as I talk about some heavy points and everything I've said in this discussion, it isn't real clear I need to be confident at any specificity about that timetable, because it isn't really clear I'm placing the definition at the timetable. But it isn't going to take forever for somebody to realize it isn't possible for anybody to see how that timetable is defined in proportion to me existing, holding this conversation. Just makes it infinitely impossible for somebody to know whether or not I'm up there at the timetable waving my hand, kissing myself, saying, "My goodness, it's so good to see you talking about these things and the anciency, about God and time and survival. Hallelujah." It isn't clear whether I'm there already or not. See, what we're going to live and what we're going to think and what we're going to believe, they aren't very creative from the timetable. They aren't very emotional. They aren't very genuine from the timetable. And there's definitely quite a bunch of tables that are valued for things maybe along these lines of what is but what we think and what we feel. You know, somebody sat, and when that timetable was created, it isn't clear that you wasn't included. It isn't clear that you wasn't a part of that. It isn't clear that you weren't a concern or considerment of the very same table. It's just clear that however that is, it is how it is, and it isn't something that is we have room for debate about, or probably any room for discussion or entertainment about. It isn't clear why we ever need to know that. Definitely isn't clear why we ever need to know that. It isn't clear why our awareness of it is going someplace that it isn't an awareness, that it isn't us, that it isn't ethical, that it isn't capable of working on survival variables at a pressure. But I can't imagine I can't imagine God getting to an orbiting mechanical body less this experience. And I'm quite sure that there's likely quite a lot more that would be a part of that. But anyway, I think about it being impossible to steal God. I think about it being impossible to manipulate God's reality, trajectory, priorities, proportionate time, survival. And I know it has everything to do with that timetable. I like it because any amount of focuses to care about a survivor or a design isn't as heavy as a divine decree at these points. It isn't as heavy and forever. You know, I can't simply sum up this discussion and hold it in a hand and decide what will be. Quite a pickle, because I've got to sustain all the forever, all the anciency stuff. I've got to sustain all the things we can do. I've got to sustain any number of things we depend on for the world or the life or the time. I've got to sustain all these things, and from where I maybe know hesitation or family, rather clearly in time, from where I know those things rather clearly, maybe you haven't ever seen it before. Thinking about it, looking at it, as much as I might know from hesitation or clarity of family, it isn't easy to consider. I can't take this discussion and decide what will be with it, as significant as it is in forever, as powerful as things. It isn't simple. It isn't easy. Who knows how impossible it needs to be for anybody to just look at me saying these things constantly and just, what could life be? This discussion it's happening after those points. So it's happening after why couldn't you ever drive me here, as free and loving as you are. And that's what majesty is all about. That conversation isn't going any further. And there's this discussion. Maybe you're going to think about it. Maybe you're going to say, or no, think. All that time I've spent wondering what life could be. And there you are at a timetable, negligizing ourselves down to very little. Because let's face it, if we can't live with each other, clearly the table and your questions and my being are at an impasse. Why does life need that impasse? I'd always wonder about that. I think about power. And clearly there's righteous. There's admission. There's necessity. There's every time I ever thought about it, how holy would it be if an experiment had nothing to do with it? They couldn't rise up and say, you judging God of forms at an impasse is too much information, it's too much power, it's too much navigation, it's too much righteousness, it's too much divinity, it's too much life. How about it? How holy could it be to have a partner's neck on the chopping block and no one able to rise to pervert it? No one able to antiquate experimental values because of all the things they've known or haven't known, all the judgments they've ever made or haven't made. It literally boiling down to forever and the truth. Nothing more. How about it? So what would that cost? Well, the relativity of the moment would have to be cut. The excursion to try and historicize it would have to be marginally and largely cut. And the speed we're going might carry some sort of evidence of our relativity to control our status, maybe for survival purposes, maybe for the integrity of relationship, maybe for conscious awareness of what we mean to each other or why we aren't things. It's rather specific, rather big, rather forever idea. And the reasons why it wouldn't be false when you get there. You know, you weren't looking at, I need to fit the forever perspective. I need to look as a survivor. I need to appear to be in it with him. It cost a lot for that to be a real. I felt there was a holy moment. I felt it wasn't possible for any number of things to be rejuvenating perversion for the sake of controlling me or influencing me or manipulating me later with all their science and technology that they don't know what the fuck they're doing with. Perverts. He doesn't know what it costs for a divine decree to be bigger in time than all the places I've ever led. But you maybe realize how deep I was prepared to pay for definitions of a timetable to not ever fail. Because once I set that table, and they are specifically who they are, and they're maybe going to be participating in defining specificity for somewhere else, those investments aren't ever going to fail. Life. So I maybe know how to limit necessity in space-time, because it ain't like all the work to crunch those possibilities is forever replicant or recurring or from scratch. But when you consider the costs to maintain all the other variables of survival and what they're dependent on and what they aren't dependent on and what matters and doesn't matter and what's critical and isn't critical, and you get to these tables about life and divinity and things, it's quite a cost to assume that it isn't going to be a dependable method, whatever the method is for space-time, well, it's clearly got to be fucking awesome. But the life we live, here's the other point. I maybe couldn't ever condition you or prove to you, you know, the way I feel about when I say the life we live, and I'm here, and however shallow or deep you feel or know these things that I'm saying, I probably could never condition you to appreciate something like, we're independent of somewhere else, and yet the forces that are like us there are maybe very differently developed. They're maybe very differently, somewhat differently defined, maybe not different at all at the timetable. So it maybe is never going to be equal what exists pressurizing that table in both locations or in multiple. What I'm talking about is where things like us exist, how they feel about knowing cost is fucking awesome for space-time or survival. Those conditions, those realities, those histories, those lives, they're different than the lives we have. And their preconceptions maybe aren't the same as our conceptions. Our lives and our experience, what we learn or what we know, is maybe different. And that's all before we ever existed. We maybe have some questions about atrophy and pressure of forever in proportion to those types of specificities. You know, I talk here at above the world. I talk here at a gravity of some points that are maybe somebody feels those points. Maybe there's some respects or some understandings or some relationships, some time, some heritage, some, you know, these are satellite points. No, these are heraldry points. No, these are like equitable relational points in all sorts of dimensions. But up through in this discussion and perspective and all these things and why the specificity is or isn't this or that, whole experience, that whole memory, we maybe have some questions about how infinitely thorough our survival plane eliminates if I isn't there caring as someone further than anciency. They ain't getting it. To start. And then clearly reality and problems and context and everything else, they're clearly subdivided beneath something like that. Isn't ever going to touch it, isn't ever going to have it, because I look at you and I think about you, and if you're here, our survival plane, all those realities of cost and paid and true and isn't and couldn't and possibilities and not expected, all of them, negligicize them all. There's a reason why that isn't taking your life away. There's a reason why that isn't compressing you to zilch. And it ain't exactly just the structure. It ain't exactly just the method. It ain't exactly just anybody. There's a reason. If I need to talk to you like this someday, then yourself and myself should be the last people existing that are going to destroy that possibility. And if you think the rest of the universe doesn't need to be able to extend investment to your planet before you wrap your head around that point, well, we're probably all going to be sadly mistaken. Because I isn't going to be incorrect about the righteousness. I isn't going to be incorrect about the value of forever likeness to be shredding at failure of survival. And I isn't incorrect about a timetable that is defined for any specific location where we're holding ourselves. If this were possible, and you live it, how are you ever going to let yourself explore in space on a lesser set of certainties? All the times you've ever wondered about being somewhere else. All the times you've ever wondered about having something else to do. All the times you weren't sure about where things are going, or from where they came, or why this, or why them, why anything. What would ever have to be true for myself, or a planet, or yourself to be safe enough for me to ask you these questions? Not everybody's going to hear these questions in these terms. Not everybody's going to experience living along these lines. and what you'd be doing to yourself. You don't know how many times a voice has been there for somebody, saving them time or energy or fiasco or however. He doesn't know how honest it would ever have to be. He doesn't know for what scheme it was ever advising really for. He doesn't know what you'd be doing to yourself. You know, somebody was going to wind up here today with any amount of experimental know-how. Piping up the things you've had to do for whoever. I doesn't see that being very honest to your holy innocence. And having no control over the speeds you're moving. Wouldn't it just be funny if it weren't possible to obliterate something, trying to force you to move at speeds you had no control over? Just wasn't possible. There was nothing in this region of space that could put an end to it. Before we even existed. It's all the more reason why you have to know. You have to know if things aren't happening within a way, there's any number of things that aren't going to be possible. I can't tell you how much there isn't a way here. I can't tell you how much somebody else is going to say it's all forever. Chances your life is ever going to be something that you think it needs to be aren't going to exist without your hesitation and without your relationship I can't say you weren't my highest priority. Clearly, life and assurances, variable placement, and details, but I can't say you weren't my highest priority. At a certain point, he doesn't know what you're doing to yourself, is spliced in a data processor to, I can't say he wasn't my highest priority, in a data processor. And there are data feeds being relayed to prioritize pressures that are simply holding facts about changes of endoscopy, of survival status for one type of thing or another type of thing. And then there's a number of these things, and they're paralleled and utilized in some conjunction to some knowing relationship of something for some reason. And without really considering any number of other facts, you just look at it and maybe you'd say, well, the responsibility for anybody's existence or life in proportion to those endoscopies probably isn't clear that any of it ever utilized in any setting, in any environment, of any world at any time by itself. Doesn't matter what they're made of, doesn't matter how they think, doesn't matter what they're built from, doesn't matter what their components are, doesn't matter what they've seen, doesn't matter what they can do. None of it matters. Just looking at the endoscopy, it isn't clear that anyone of any number at any time, left to their own devices, is going to face pressure, enough of it, to care about continuing in a future with somebody that loves them from the endoscopies. The endoscopies aren't going to do it. And God only knows how many things contribute and depend and draw and look at endoscopies. Who the fuck needs an endoscopy governing a planet? At a certain point, all there is he doesn't know what you're doing to yourself. Connected to a data relay that's spliced to, I can't say you weren't my highest priority. Connected to a data relay, and there's any number of the same thing in tandem, until God comes out of the blue with impeccable timing and pressure and says, who the fuck needs an endoscopy governing the planet? I can't say you weren't my highest priority. So that's what I know. You know, the things I look at and the things that come my way and the things in my environment and the energy that I experience in time. It isn't real clear that any of these things are concentrated or concerned or aware of how much I knew that, how much I know that today, what it means to my life, what it means to the integrity that exists, or the lack thereof at any point in time, of anything. It isn't clear what all that stuff means. You know, the more you could or would or otherwise would try to be present near to concentrations like these things, who knows how many types of integrities change. You know, you just doesn't have the tools to solve all the integrity of this world's survival plane isn't batting against me. You know, I doesn't want to spend all our lives depleted by these variables. And it just sucks that I can do something He just doesn't and is never going to have the tools to prove why all the changes of integrity of this world's survivor plane isn't betting against me. You know, I doesn't want to spend all our lives depleted by these variables, and it just sucks that I can do something about all their time being unnecessarily wasted in space-time. But there are other ones. If your pretty little butt wasn't in my hands physically, God would never ask you to honor that in these lights. But there are other ones. You can clearly make now possible. You're going to have to live with that. If your pretty little butt wasn't in my hands physically, God would never ask you to honor that in these lights. But there are other ones. All the times I've ever let a body of anything didn't clearly make now possible, and you're going to have to live with that, because I intend to care and love you very largest and most soulfully. So we could contain ourselves. so we could contain ourselves with the world, and you and I should be the last two living that are ever on their way to destroy that. You got me? Alright. Also include maybe I doesn't have to care if aliens exist, because they doesn't precipitate. Just he doesn't ever let that be your excuse. Maybe it doesn't have to care if aliens exist because they doesn't precipitate. It doesn't precipitate. Just he doesn't ever let that be your excuse, dear. Battery's good. So I've been speaking for a little while, and clearly delving with a mind. So I clearly thought a lot about the timetable ultimacy reality, and if my mind can do it, is somewhat of a parabolic I'd say diagnosis, but it's also in so many places. you know, angels are going to look at anybody that, I mean, maybe they have a clearly undefined relationship to some of the points that I brought up. The couldn't drive here, which is, I mean, that's a universal question. It's also a survival question. I'm just saying the pressure is universal. Containment of the survival sanctity of it is clearly maybe a relatively global situation. It's maybe variable weighted in proportion to things of forever. It's maybe also variable weighted in proportion to the timetable that I mentioned, because it is such a specific question of survival. I mean, there's, you may look at a question like that and say, why can things continue? I didn't need to drive it there. I couldn't drive it there. What does that mean? What were the obstacles? What were the things? Why were things enshrined? Why were there limits? What do these relationships have in common? There's all of that, but you maybe haven't looked at it that way. This is a very heavy question. So, clearly, if my mind could do it, was clearly a contributing force to defining structure, rigid structure of a possibility like that. Namely, what givens would you be comfortable with, able to utilize, and what would the breadth of these givens provide survival? I didn't say what would they provide an environment, what would they provide a table, what would they provide a data set, what would they provide a mind, what would they provide a situation, what would they provide an interest. I didn't say that. What would they provide survival? Okay. So, the more clingy and the more forcey anything might be or have been near to that question, probably isn't clear what that would produce or what that would necessitate. What types of interests would ever be there. So maybe you'd have a clue about interests in proportion to that question. Maybe you'd have a clue about the context being somewhat in a divine, in an escalation, this is nearing a maxim of there's how many physics spectrums, how many dimensional spectrums, any awareness that would even sense the question probably has no idea how many things might ever be fixated on such a question. What is that? Is that the last two people that are ever on their way to destroying a timetable? Definitely not. So what is going to stop that from being true? Why is the question not a dedicated time investment just because things touch physics, just because things touch spectrums, just because things say me, my, this. Again, if that couldn't be solved for that question, your time is forever wasted. Your relational affinity in proportion to expectancy is forever changed, forever distant, forever unpredictable. Ooh. But it ain't why I would ever invest beside you. That's precisely what it is. That question comes up, it's every reason in the universe why I isn't investing beside you. by choice. So clearly, all the time, all the study of anybody's mind that has ever faced a conclusion like that, all the stewardability potentiates, again, we get to connections that aren't holding other connections, stores of Q, of situational, statutory, status, survival plane, very, very, very tight-knit, non-negotiable types of parameters, just so the knowns could be clear, just so the time could be maybe somewhat semi-rigidly clear in some scopes. I mean, what facts would ever need to be present in proportion, something like that. But it's clearly all variable dense, considering the fact that I myself am delivering this discussion in these circumstances at a time in a pressure. That definitely alters any number of definitives about flows of such question. See, before you get to the seat of that very narrow possibility where you'd be looking at that status, it's under a question mark. It isn't clear that I'm defining the question mark's existence, but the circumstances, the conditions, the reality maybe change the weight of the question mark in proportion to life or forever or time. So the variable dimensions can change accordingly in proportion to these things. That has a cost. Infinite number of complex problem statuses mitigated by the specificity. It isn't clear that the frequency of that question ever decreases from 100% fuck all. But that's not something that's ever going to exist in God's mind. It's not something that's ever going to exist in any number of minds. That's going to be something that exists in a base at basics in proportion to pressure density that ever occurs in proportion to an environment. See? Here's an example. I'm a mind. I know that question exists at a basic. I also know that question is every reason why everyone in the universe isn't going to want to invest. Anyone in the universe isn't going to want to invest beside me by choice. That's all I know. Now just set me free. See what I come up with. Now, how many times do you think I've done that? It isn't changing the fact. I'll write that too. I'll show you. Your narrow feed exists under a question devoid of the specifics of my conditioning as God. Now watch. I is anybody. That cost exists at a basic, and that question is why anybody isn't ever going to want to invest beside me. Now set me free. Period. That's all I knows. Now, how many times do you think I've let that happen? All those times of experiment have nothing to do with the fact you feel, you live. I feel and live. And define these things. The cost for you to know or express what life means to you is more important to me than all the false security created by that experiment. I'll show you. Your narrow feed exists under a question, devoid of the specifics under my conditioning as God. Now watch. I is anybody. That cost exists at a basic, and that question is why anybody is never going to want to invest beside me. Now set me free. Period. That's all I knows. Now how many times do you think I've let that happen? All those times of experiment have nothing to do with the fact you feel, you live, I feel and live and define these things. The cost for you to know or express what life means to you is more important to me than all the false security created by that experiment. Anyway, I was saying, and you feel this time, and you feel me talking, literally all of that data and all of those experiences and all of the weights of those variables, they're all valued and they're all a part of anybody that clearly rests on dimensions. That's what I was thinking about. But there's a lot of things these things aren't. And there's a lot of things that the variable dimensions would otherwise be if it wasn't for something. If it wasn't for something. So maybe you get to things like such a conversation is so yielding of apathy fruit, potentially. But we're headed towards questions of proof that aren't going to sustain something. Here's the trick. Maybe the conversation is yielding of apathy fruit, but we're headed to questions of proof. That maybe isn't sustaining something. Now, who doesn't break the glass? That defines cohabitation. Here's the trick. Maybe the conversation is yielding of apathy fruit, but we're headed to questions of proof that maybe isn't sustaining something. Now, who doesn't break that glass? That defines cohabitation probability above God. Anyway, the point is, I'm probably going to conclude the discussion, and you know, the nice thing is I isn't ever going to tell you how I feel about rationality. I'll also add, there should be some thanks, or sentiment of thanks, for all those that have suffered and died. Protect any world from my antithesis. In all the courses of duty, duty in life. There should be some thanks, or a lot of thanks, for all those that have suffered and died to protect any world from my antithesis, in all their way courses of duty in life. If you think anywhere in the universe extends its arms against me, you're sadly mistaken. I am so defined.